When America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold, right? When you look at the economists, obviously they're saying that America's policy is counterproductive or it's not going to fulfill its policy goals. The other part that I think about is it's going to be so much worse for Cambodia or Vietnam, right? Because these tariffs are really like a very large chunk of the export sector.
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave.
Hey Shiyan, how are you?
I mean, so many ways to answer that question. I feel pretty good.
Yeah?
I went to a day of rugby.
Yeah.
How am I thinking about the world? I don't know. I watched the market go down 10% in 2 days.
Yeah, Liberation Day.
But-
yeah.
Worldwide tariffs and a step back a couple hundred years. I don't know. How are you, Jeremy? How are you feeling?
I definitely felt very glued to the internet for the past few days because as somebody who studied economics and read a lot of economic history, we really felt like this was
Blast from the
inflection-
past.
But it's definitely an inflection point, and I think it's interesting because you walk around every day and I think people kind of know it's happening, but they don't know what it really means. And I thought it was just interesting to see me process actually on one level like the logical sequencing and consequence, which I think we'll discuss, but also from my perspective, a bit of an emotional set of feelings as well, actually. So I thought it was interesting to unpack those, self-reflection.
Yeah, I mean, the emotional thing is an interesting one. It's hard to articulate. I think it's sort of like we came of age during peak globalization.
The
Right.
world is flat, America.
WTO, the end of history, like that kind of thing. And now it seems like we've gone like 180 from that we no longer believe in any of those things, apparently.
Well, one administration does not believe in it to the same extent as you do. Of course, it's interesting to have that sensation, right? And I think
Yeah, it's a dislocation feeling, I
Yeah.
think. Yeah, I don't know. It feels just totally bonkers to me.
Yeah. So maybe I think for the benefit of like everybody, we'll just do a very quick recounting of what has happened, right? So Trump has on Liberation Day announced a set of
April 2nd.
On April 2nd.
So that it wasn't on April Fool's Day, so no one would be confused because it is not a joke.
It's not a joke. It was on April 2nd. And he basically announced that at minimum, there is an import tariff, right?
10%
across the board. And there is also going to be additional higher tariffs. So, for example, Singapore will be at the minimum, which is at 10%. And then Indonesia is around 30+%. Vietnam is at 45%. And then China, the net tariff is about 60% right now. And now, of course, if you look at America as a whole, I think the weighted average of all those tariffs used to be around, say, 3%, all right, for the past couple hundred years, has now gone up to about 23%.
Yeah.
Which is the last time America was there, was in the 1800s under the Smoot-Hawley Act. So I think it's obviously, you can call it reversion to the tariff level or cyclical, but definitely is a big change from an economics perspective.
I mean, I think it's just bonkers, right?
Yeah.
Like when the Smoot-Hawley Act was in place, right? Think about the amount of global trade that actually happened that was impacted by that number versus like these interconnected supply chains and economies that we have today.
Right.
And so I think prices are going to go across. But who's interesting? Who was left out of the list of countries, Jeremy?
Oh, no, I don't know.
Well, Mexico and Canada are left out.
Yeah, because they have their own set of tariffs negotiations happening right now. Yep.
And Russia was left out.
Oh, huh.
So I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I thought that was curious.
Maybe I think he's like holding it back for some sort of negotiation around Ukraine.
I don't
Let it
know.
all shake out.
I don't know. But then, of course, he taxed the penguins on Heard Island, which was very funny.
Yeah, well, I think arguably every country had a 10% tax. I think that's part of me, which is like, okay, some of it makes a bit of sense, which is like, I think if you put a global import tariff of 10%, it doesn't allow anybody to do some transshipment, like
Moving your factory to Vietnam. Or
Yeah,
something.
exactly, right? And I think it's been interesting to think through some of the logic of it, right? Which is, I think from their perspective, the logic of what they're saying is, hey, we are trying to account for tariffs on American imports, non-trade tariffs, but restrictions on American imports.
Yeah, but if you look at the actual math of it, they basically just looked at what the trade balance was, and then they divided it in two,
Yeah.
and they declared that number to be the non-trade barrier amount that was being imposed on the US.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I feel like everyone who's done econ has done comparative advantage, and there's reasons why you produce chips, or the classic guns and butter, right? Like you produce guns and I produce butter, and then we trade, and everyone is better off because you can make more guns and I can make more butter than if we both try to make guns and butter ourselves.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know, I find the whole thing just a little bit ludicrous.
Yeah. And I think it's tricky, right? Because a country like Cambodia, which is very small, relatively rich compared to America, economy has very much been focused on servicing textiles. I think half of the economy is textiles and most of it is going to America.
Yes, because Cambodians don't have that much money to buy US import.
Exactly. So it's not really a tariff. They don't have any barriers on American imports. It's just more a function that they don't have money, unfortunately.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know, I find the whole thing just a little bit ridiculous. But I mean, I think all that to say, there are real problems in the US, right?
Yeah.
Is this the most efficient way to address them? I think that's a conversation that we can have. But I mean, I think there's a definite chilling effect on global trade. We talked a little bit about this, right? The reaction is going to be, okay, well, how do we trade with everyone else that is not the US, right? How do we create more corridors for that to happen? I think it accelerates the move to the multipolar world. So I don't know. Is that the outcome that the US is trying to drive alongside this sort of onshoring of manufacturing and things like that? And who is rushing to make huge manufacturing investments when you feel like the person making the rules is a little bit mercurial and you might not want to make big commitments if everything is going to change
Right.
overnight?
Yeah.
So I don't know. It just feels bananas.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should, unpack that, right? Because I think there's two parts, right? Which is, well, three parts. I think the first part is what's the logic behind this for the Americans' perspective? I think that's one side. And then the second part is what is the world's reaction to that? And the third, of course, is there's a little bit of evaluation of the execution of how has it been done, right?
Yeah.
So maybe we'll start with the first part is like, let's unpack, I think, the logic from the American administration, because they have a strong economic and leadership team, right? There's Scott Bessent, there's Lutkin. So I think there's a really strong, I'll say, bench of financial leadership, I would say. So how would you think about it from your explanation of the logic from the administration perspective?
One version of a story you might tell yourself is, well, we have a big sort of debt problem. We need to get that under control. So either we need to like raise revenue or decrease costs, or preferably both, right? That's sort of like, so how can we do that, right? So I think on the cost side, you sort of had Elon and Doge kind of running around trying to like cut costs.
Yeah.
And I think we talked a little bit about this before, which is like the biggest costs in the US budget really are debt servicing, entitlements, and the military, right?
Yeah.
And so all this other stuff like USAID and all these other things, like those are like for show. But like if you really want to move the needle on the budget, like costs, you actually need to deal with one of those things, right? So the debt, because you're paying a lot in interest, entitlements, which so far most people treat as a third rail, like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and then the military. So then we come to the revenue side, right? Which is like, how do we raise revenue? Republicans are historically allergic to raising taxes. So what do? They're like, okay, well, let's tax the rest of the world, which is really what the tariffs are, right? So that's one way to raise revenue. And I guess you could sort of make the argument that over time, right, as the US dollar also, I guess, depreciates a little bit,
It's a stated goal of administration,
then that also makes like US exports like more competitive in the market, which should help trade balances and all that other stuff. So, I mean, you could tell yourself some version of that story. I think it assumes that the impact of the tariffs will not be outweighed by the decrease in demand as prices go up, right? That there's some inelasticity to demand, and that I suppose if you're really cynical, you could say that the majority of this will be borne by people who consume the most anyway, and those are rich people.
Yeah, and I love to respond to that, which is, I think that, first of all, the Republican Party has been focused on the deficit and focusing on the...
But then why do they keep taxes?
Well, they haven't cut taxes yet.
No, he cut taxes in his first
administration, but not in the second administration yet. So we'll see how much of that
in the seat for like 2 months or 3 months or whatever, right? But
Yeah,
like,
so we'll find out soon. So how much of the tax cuts are retained? But yeah, I agree that. But I would say that the Republican Party has said that this is a policy platform for them, right? Which is that they want to make sure that the books are more balanced and government debt shouldn't keep going up, and they're willing to do a government shutdown, right, to make sure that the creditworthiness of America as a state, right, is true. And I think there's a lot of people who are very much focused on this topic, right? I think Ray Dalio obviously has been predicting a debt crisis for America if America doesn't either cut spending or increase taxation enough to their. I think Mary Meeker also wrote a report, an updated report recently. She looked at America as a corporation and said, hey, if this was a corporation, how does the assets versus interest? And I think one of the key insights was that America has benefited from very low interest rates, but because of so much spending that's happened over the past decade, especially over multiple administrations, then basically like if interest rates were to go up a little bit, then government spending will balloon a lot because of interest repayments. So basically, I think there is, a credible argument from my perspective.
I think problem identification is not wrong.
Yeah.
Which is that they spend too much money and they don't spend it productively.
So what we're saying is
I agree with
you got to
that.
balance the books more because we don't want to have a heart attack, right? And a heart attack is at some point of time, everybody gets spooked, interest rates go up, then people find the debt can't be serviced well because interest went up, and then interest rates go up even higher, and then so there's been a heart attack scenario that people are worried about from a financial system perspective. So I do think that's fair. So that's one. And then two is, I guess, if you look at the pillars, it from an effect basis, I'm not talking about the media, not about how it's executed, but there is cost cutting on the government side. And then there is tariffs, which is a form of tax on both external producers and internal consumers. Obviously, tax cuts, the action is still about half a year to a year away. So I guess you could look at that and say like it's coherent, perhaps on a net basis versus that problem identification. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I guess though, to me, it feels like when someone is in debt and you're like, stop drinking that latte. Actually, your bigger problem is that the house you live in is too expensive. Like that's like 30% of your budget is your housing, and 30% of your budget is like your car loan or whatever it is. And then you fixate on this thing, which is like, oh, it's that latte you drink every day. Right? That's kind of what it feels like on the cost cutting side. Is like there's actually big boulders to move.
Yeah.
And instead of having a serious discussion about those things, you're going through all this stuff sort of unnecessarily and cruelly, but not actually achieving your goal. So I think there's that one thing. And then on the revenue side, I mean, I'm interested to see like what happens, right? But I think that in general, markets don't like uncertainty and predictability, and in general, markets want to know and have confidence that they can invest behind a specific set of policies. And I think so far, I'm not sure this administration has given people that kind of confidence.
Yeah, which I think goes back to the execution and messaging side.
Which is half the work, right? It's all great to have a great plan, but if you don't execute the plan properly, then the plan's worthless, right? And then I think the second piece is on the spending stuff. How do you think, like, let's imagine this magical world where everyone starts building plants in America. Who's going to work in those plants? Like, literally, who wants those jobs? And are they educated enough for the jobs? Because at the type of labor rates that Americans expect, these are pretty high-skilled jobs. This isn't a pure manual labor job. And the US has systematically underinvested in public education. So cutting spending is one thing. Then of the spending you're doing, are you actually investing in both your human capital and your physical infrastructural things to enable you to generate that GDP, right? And it's the same thing. The US has underinvested in roads, in bridges, in trains, all the sort of stuff that you think about as how do you grow the productivity of your base.
Yeah, I think it's tricky, right? And understand that. And also, you can make an argument that that pain is what's needed to raise wages to the point where it becomes okay for Midwestern America, Rust Belt America, for example. But I think there are places where I think you can make an argument, and I think this argument that's also being made is that, okay, like you said, tariffs are a tax on domestic consumers who want to buy imports, and that burden is shared with external producers, right? So that raises prices, and those import are a lot of them are going to people on the coast, right?
I mean,
So
yes and no, right? So like Shein and Temu, they did a study, right? And looked at all the zip codes of the buyers, the consumers. Those people are in low income zip codes.
Yeah.
right?
I mean, yeah.
So like, I think consumers benefit from having cheaper goods,
Yeah, inflation is a
right?
function of
So
prices and Chinese goods. Like I think we do know that TVs, for example, and PlayStations and electronics
yeah,
have gotten cheaper. There's been a deflation of those prices over the past 30 years because of Asian manufacturing making it cheaper and cheaper for Americans to buy TVs, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think Nintendo, like their new generation Switch, they put a hold on pre-orders
Yeah, I
because
mean, yeah, we know
they need to reprice the
exactly.
console, right? They need
Yeah,
to reprice the device before they start selling it in the US, given the relatively high tariff that was imposed on Japan, which is a US ally.
very high. I think about 20,
Yeah.
30% higher than Singapore. So yeah, it's gonna be tricky for them to manufacture. I think Apple as well. I think there was a very much a article where it's like every Apple device is at least several $100s worth of text on just a raw components. So if you have an iPhone for $1,000 effectively the tariff will raise that price to $1,400 if all of it was given to and passed on to the consumer.
But also, like, you think about it, right? Like, if I'm Apple, am I only going to raise prices in the US? No, right? I'm going to raise prices everywhere else to try to make up my margin.
Yeah, I mean, I think also the supply chain obviously is everybody's reconfiguring their factories.
You reconfigure it too.
Well, I mean, the automobile factories have been switching off factories in Canada and Mexico because, it doesn't make sense for the component to travel from America to the factory and from the factory back into America because you get tariffed twice, effectively.
Yeah, but I think once again, this is like, are you achieving your goal?
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's like Trump already negotiated the free trade agreement with Mexico and Canada in the first administration, right?
Yeah.
He renegotiated NAFTA to get to that agreement. People made decisions, their supply chain exists across this free trade zone. And then you come back and you're like, oh, just kidding.
Yeah.
Like, is that actually going to increase the amount of manufacturing in the US when you do that? Because then people are like, how can I rely on what you say? So I don't know. I think it's just gonna be really messy.
And Singapore has a free trade agreement with America that has persevered through both Republican and Democratic administrations. And now there's a US 10% tariff, which is not in coherence with the free trade agreement bilateral between Singapore and America.
Yeah, yeah.
Tricky.
So, and despite that, I feel like the big strength of the US has always been that people they want to live there. People want to move there, right?
I mean, if you had the green card, now there's the Trump gold card for $5 million to buy opportunity to move to America. The truth is, I think Trump has identified a viable point, which is if there was legal immigration, which I think the gold card represents.
Always had the EB5 program anyway. There was always the investor route, right, to do it. So
I think the difference is that the quantum of going and being invested in American businesses and stock market now just goes to the US government as a quantum.
the old program is you had to invest in a US business and you
Yeah.
had to say that you were able to like hire how many Americans
Exactly.
as
So,
a
yeah.
function of your thing, which eventually trickles through to PID. But yeah, sure. I mean, you can sell citizenships and things like that. But I think even more like the bigger idea that like it's the biggest, deepest market there is. And so if you're an entrepreneur, you're someone who wants to have access to that, you want to bet on yourself, you want to build a business, then you still want to go to the US. You still are willing to make that bet. But I don't know. I mean, I lived in the US during the first Trump administration and I found it to be incredibly weird.
Yeah, I was studying and working during the Obama election and the transition, and also the great financial recession in 2008, which was, I think, a big, interesting thing to observe. And at that time, I kind of knew it was a big deal, but I didn't realize why it was a big deal.
Yeah.
And obviously, I also saw I was there during the first Trump administration as well.
Yeah.
I think it is a very big reordering, right? Because I think prior guests on the Brave podcast have shared that they feel that historically the Southeast Asia, like for example Vietnam, has been adjusting its currency, right, to devalue the currency to basically subsidize their exporting industries. So they do feel like, hey, the Vietnam tariff is higher than expected, but not unexpected versus this policy goal. And then of course, the argument is that this is also a negotiation starting point to anchor the conversation and then eventually be negotiated down from 45% down to, I don't know what the final number is going to be. So I think that it goes back to the second bucket that we talked about, right? Which is how's the world going to react? So I think some countries are going to accept this. I think Singapore has said that they're not going to retaliate, they're going to negotiate. I think that's what Singapore said.
I mean, what leverage does Singapore have, really?
Yeah, that's like, yeah, I agree. So, and then I think China has done a tit for tat. So they've applied the same amount, which is 34% of additional tariffs on American goods. So I think there's a signaling for tit for tat. I guess game theory is
Yeah.
whatever you do, I mirror. So I think that's one. And of course, the EU right now is working on that package. And I think they will deliver counter tariffs. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think I'm like a big let's grow the pie sort of person,
Yeah.
right? Like the sum is the whole is greater than the parts or whatever. And this is like a very naked, like, no, there's a fixed pie.
Yeah.
We're the big guy, we're the bully, and we're gonna go just get as much of it as we can. And if you don't like it, like, so be it. And I think that is the prerogative of large countries. But it makes me a little bit sad, right? Because I think the US was instrumental in building this global order post World War II that sort of promoted this idea of like, hey, we can have more peace and more prosperity if we all trade with each other.
Right.
And now I feel like because they did not address issues in their own house around retraining and education and some of these other topics, now they're just like, okay,
Yeah.
flipping the board.
Yeah, no, I think it's true, right? In that the tariffs are all on goods, right? And it's not on services. And services is where the American economy has really become number one. I mean, the technology companies
Yeah.
would be included under the services bucket because they don't transact physical goods, they're doing digital services. And then obviously you have your big four, your consultancy. So I think America has really become like that global services piece. And this tariff, I think I underappreciated this, but it only applies to goods, right? And so I think it's a way to move manufacturing back to America. Anyway, so I just think it's a interesting bifurcation. And in my head, I'm obviously, if you take it the other way, it's like you take that proverb of like in every crisis there's opportunity. So what's the opportunity in this inflection point, right?
I mean, I guess all the domestically based industries, right? So
in
if
the
you're like a
US.
US based
Yeah.
company serving US customers, we have a portfolio company that does like refurbishment of high end brand clothes. So it's actually a tailwind for them,
Yeah.
right? Because
Yeah.
the goods are already in the US
Yeah.
and there's no additional tariff and they're like fixing them and selling them on again, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, there's curious things like that. I mean, I think with all the hawkishness as well, I think defense, anything
Yeah.
that's defense facing, right? Like after all the saber rattling and everything, right? Like what is it? Germany said they raised their debt ceiling, their debt cap, and now they're like, okay, we're going to commit, was it 50 billion?
Yeah.
And all around, everyone is going to do that, right? So I think all the defense people are going to benefit. And then I guess, yeah, anyone who sells digital services.
I mean, because physical stuff is becoming more, the physical world becomes more expensive.
Yeah.
But the digital world is just as good, right?
Yeah.
Like if I bought a computer game on Steam,
Yeah.
it's the same price.
Yeah,
It doesn't impact it by tariffs.
Yeah.
But if I buy a CD-ROM, that is taxed, right? So there's an interesting piece where I think to some extent may even accelerate the digitalization of, I would say definitely the American consumer, but also the whole world, right? Because buy less champagne, buy more movies, all right? Because you're like, I mean, you're numbing yourself to life with alcohol, which is expensive, and then now you can numb yourself with Netflix, which is not taxed, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the economics, obviously, this is the focus of the conversation, but like, I think there's also just like the cultural aspect of it, which makes me like a little bit sad, right? Which is like the attacking of immigrants, the deportations, the random searches of people entering the country and looking at their social media records and things like that. It's hard to square that with previously stated American ideals of freedom of speech and human rights and democracy, right? I think it just sort of exposes the hypocrisy of all that prior rhetoric.
I mean, I think Lee Kuan Yew was very much on the record for never having believed that in the first place, especially in the context of the Cold War, where I think there was a lot of those ideals being stated, but it was very much a brutal power struggle on a global stage, right? I mean, we saw that in the Vietnam War, the Korean War, where I think obviously both sides were claiming high ideals, but how that translated into the messiness of conflict was very disappointing for so many people. And so I think the interesting part is like post-Cold War and today, I think there was this summer, right, where it felt like all of this was said at face value and is accepted at face value, I feel.
Yeah.
And I think we're just kind of reverting back to that piece where we're like, oh no, it's just a multipolar world that is. And I think it was interesting where it was like, this is the first US administration that's publicly stated that it is a multipolar world, right? So I think it's an interesting dynamic because past US administrations never ever used the phrase multipolar world as part of their policy statements.
I mean, I guess it's reality, right? But I mean, I think this is the same thing, right? where there's this dislocation feeling, right? Because we came of age in a moment where globalization was at its peak, right?
Idealism.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know, and maybe this is like completely naive of me, right? Which is like growing up in the 80s and 90s, you watch American television,
Oh,
you listen to American music, you imbibe some notions of these things, whether
Yeah.
it's freedom of speech or protest or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And then I don't know what the scales fall off your eyes, and you're like, just kidding. That was the marketing message, but the actual product a bit different, huh?
Yeah, I mean, I always remember watching Independence Day. I remember like Will Smith, and then there was the American president, and then America rallies the whole world to do a simultaneous attack on all these alien sources. And then I think there's this wonderful montage at the end of the scene where he's like, "On my signal, let's go." And then I think that it shows like the Chinese also blowing up their saucer at the same time, and the Russians. Everybody's all like doing this like, global coordinated defense of Earth against the aliens.
Yeah, not gonna happen though.
It's like it's an interesting piece, right?
Yeah, so I think there's an aspect of it. It's just like, hey, everyone is their own, just trying to make it in the world. They're trying to survive. They're trying to get the best deal for their country or whatever it is. And you don't have any friends. You just have people whose interests are temporarily aligned with yours. You should behave accordingly.
I mean, that's the real politic. Kissinger, that would be Mir at University of Chicago. That would be politics, which is the strong do what they want and the weak do what they must. And like it's a
Yes, I think and maybe that's a good, right? We should all like live in this reality.
yeah.
So
What do you think to wrap things up? Is there any advice that you have? So what are the plays here, right? So one is like build in America. Whilst is it move to America? Is it build for your domestic? I mean, how would you say some of your
oh man,
Yeah.
I think it just depends on who you are, right?
Yeah.
With all the turmoil, right, and the uncertainty, I think that people are mostly like more risk off than before, right?
Yeah.
So I think that makes fundraising harder, and all these things become harder. So like I think if you're a founder, you want to stay lean, stay frugal,
Yeah.
don't count on
Yeah.
copious amounts of VC money. And I mean, I don't know, it's interesting, right? I mean, I think for young people, I generally tell them like you should go work in the US at some point in your life because you should work in a big, deep market that's incredibly competitive.
Right.
I think for people who are older, who have kids and families and aging parents and things like that, I think the calculus is a bit harder, right? Because it isn't a purely professional calculation.
Yeah.
And then everyone kind of has to like weigh that themselves.
Right.
I mean, I think on a personal level, like even when you live in a blue sort of bubble like San Francisco, the sort of anti-immigrant rhetoric is like quite tiring and it sometimes makes you feel unsafe.
Right.
And then it raises questions around like, is that the environment you want your kids to grow up in? Because they're sort of being up continually. I don't know. Maybe it's like one of those character building experiences or something. But I think that's like an open question in my mind. Yeah, I think that's like sort of like you can't stop the US from being the biggest, deepest market, right? And it's just like the S&P is like if you were even you're gonna reallocate, like where would you reallocate away from, right? Like those are still like the biggest, most well-run companies in the world. So you're still going to have an allocation there. So I think it's like a very personal question.
Yeah. And I think one thing I think about is like, when America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold, right? So I think when you look at the economists, obviously they're saying that America's policy is, counterproductive or it's not going to fulfill its policy goals. But even so, it just means, and I think this is where some projections by Financial Times also is like this will cause a recession in America or it will slow down the growth rate. It's just that the other part that I think about is it's going to be so much worse for Cambodia or Vietnam, right? Because these tariffs are really like a very large chunk of the export sector. And I do think that in Southeast Asia, one part that I think about is that it can really be quite problematic. So assuming, let's just say the tariffs don't get negotiated down, then this is bad for Indonesia, for Vietnam, obviously Chinese exports. And then all these shrink. And then Singapore is a hub for Asia. It's also a shipment hub for all these products. And Singapore itself, even though it is a relative winner by having less tariffs on its exports to America, it still has a net shrinkage because it's no longer a shipping and financial hub for the region, right? So I do think there's a lot of pain.
I think it was being shipped by Singapore to the US, but to the extent that people will try to do more regionally, Singapore still benefits from that.
Yeah.
And the Indonesian economy is relatively less exposed to exports than the Vietnamese one, right? So I think that's the word. It's like you're doubling down on your domestic capacity.
Yeah.
And you should use the time to make investments in things that will pay off domestically so that you can have a more balanced economy.
Right.
And then maybe that's like, we're going to figure out ways to trade with LATAM. We're going to figure out ways to trade with Africa. We're going to find ways to do things that are not just purely exporting to the US.
Yeah.
I mean, less an issue for Singapore, right? We don't actually manufacture that much stuff.
Yeah.
But I think for the other countries, right, is trying to.
Because Singapore has a lot of services as well.
Yeah.
On that note, let's tie things off. I think the two big takeaways I got from this conversation is one is thinking through what the tariffs are from a US Trump administration perspective would be number one. I think number two is us thinking through what the rest of the world consequences are and their counteractions mean. And then lastly, of course, is advice to folks about what to watch out for and perhaps what the opportunities are as well.
Yeah.
I don't know. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.